Welcome to the GMologist Presents. This is my special show number 300 on the GMologist Presents podcast. And for this special, since it's 300, I have three people forming a panel. Each of you and me included are worth 100 points because we're going to give 100% to this podcast. I know that sounds silly and corny, but hey, that's what we're all about sometimes. But in honor of 300, I'm going back to something that I've always wanted to talk about and do. And that is, we see a lot playing a game or running a game, because this is about RPGs mainly, in a Greek inspired world. So this panel is on playing a tabletop role-playing game based on Greek myth, whether it's pseudo Greek myth from video games or Greek myth from, Bullfinch's mythology, based on literature, such as the Iliad or the Odyssey, or based on history. And I have two amazing people on for me today. Tyler from Cleric or Ringmail, who you've heard. He gave a series a couple years ago on gaming in Greek-inspired Near East Bronze Age as a contrast to a more Western-themed game. And then one of my good friends, Arlen Walker of Live from Pelham's Wasteland, who to me is the person I know who's the classical gamer scholar. He knows all things, I think, on the classical world, which includes Greek and Roman, and probably other adjacent cultures to that time frame. So the first question I'm going to ask my panelists and take it away. I hope you guys do most of the talking. Is what would be or what are, because I know like Tyler has set up games in this kind of genre, and Arlen, I don't know if you've set up games honestly, but I know we've talked about setting up games in these types of, of, of backgrounds. What are your inspirations, you think, for a Greek inspired game?
I'll start us off a little bit here. This is Taylor over at the Cleric Square Ringmail / Whispering GM podcast. Uh, Drinking, and I wish I had thought about this in advance. I would have been drinking an ouzo or maybe the Nosa from the sweet wine that they have out there. But I did not think ahead, so I've got a winter porter with me. But why do I bring those up? Those two drinks that I mentioned, the ouzo and the Nausa, those are from mainland Greece, and uh, we're talking a little bit about the Hellenic world. Uh, the one of my favorite parts about the Hellenic world, as it comes to gaming, is that it's much more wide-reaching than a lot of people give it credit for. If we're talking about early in the uh, classical Greek period, it ranges from the Aegean out southwards into Egypt, and there's stelae on the Egyptian walls and tombs and that you can depict. You can see Greeks. They have a very distinct way of depicting their hair, in particular in their skin tones, compared to what contemporary Egyptians look like. And then additionally, you have the wars in against the Etruscans and the Proto-Romans, and you have Greek trade going as far as Cyprus. And so one of the fun inspirations for me as it pertains to gaming, and I hope that's the question. I started talking and then I realized I may have gone off subject, but one of the things that draws me in to RPG type gaming, and folks who may recognize my voice recognize it as more of an OSR guy. So I'll be talking D&D stuff, but
Mhm.
yeah, I hope everyone will forgive me. But one of the core tenets of these kind of adventure games for me is exploration, and that's something the Greeks did a lot of. Uh, you can find evidence of them up throughout the Black Sea, into all throughout the Mediterranean, much farther than one who was mere only classically versed. So we have our high school reading. Someone who never went further than that may not realize that there were Greek colonies all the way there are accounts of Greeks having traveled all the way to Cornwall in England during the Mycenaean period,
Mhm.
following Phoenician and Carthaginian traders to try to cut the middleman for tin supplies. Um,
I had a question just on speaking of that, or a comment too. So you're saying that even in like, let's say, older Middle Kingdom, right? Because we know about like the Ptolemaic period and the Greek influence there, but you're saying that even in Old and Middle Kingdom Egypt, there are records of uh,
oh yeah,
Greek, or
absolutely. I'll see
we're
if I can.
calling Greek, but I mean, we know they're city states, so we're not going to be totally historically accurate. You know, they're city states, so they didn't call themselves Greek necessarily. But people from the Aegean Sea region, from that peninsula, right, were in and
Absolutely.
around. Okay.
I'll find a picture of it for you. But in the Egyptian writings, the Egyptians at that time were a very old culture. That's easy to say because Egypt is one of the that they're second only to like in terms of their history. The Egyptians found the Greeks to be very well mannered and well educated, and they got along famously. The Egyptians spoke very poorly of most Levantine peoples, like they were not impressed with the Semitic speaking peoples. They really hated the Hittites and the Assyrians, but they were fond of the Greeks because of the culture. They had cultural exchanges, and they felt like they were a refined people compared to those barbarians out in, it's not Anatolia, is it? But yeah, in you'd think I'd be a lot further into this beer than I am, but
Yeah, and another cool anecdote that supports that is, like, I saw a program on Tintagel Castle recently, and it dates back to the Bronze Age before the reconstruction of the castle. But in the digs there, they found trade items from the Near East and Aegean region. So definitely, we think of these groups as very regional and small-minded, but they did extend out into the great wider world a lot further than we traditionally give them credit for.
Hmm.
Well,
Yep.
and I think that's one of the interesting things talking about the kind of historical side, is that, I mean, we talk about, I was giving Carl grief about the Bronze Age, but we talk about the ages, the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, which you can see very quickly are designations based on very durable archaeological artifacts as opposed to any of the other things that we might use to categorize those periods. Um, but one thing about that is that bronze is made out of relatively rare materials. Tin in particular is really quite rare inside the Earth's crust, especially in large amounts. And even though you don't need a whole lot of tin, I think it's 88 copper to 12 tin or so. What it means is that a lot of Bronze Age societies around all over the Mediterranean and Europe, and even kind of getting into like the Sahara Desert hadn't totally desertified by that point, and so there's a lot of different cultures around this kind of broad Eurasian and North African area that are really dependent on long range trade for the most sophisticated technologies that they possess, basically. Um, and that is sort of the basis of the civilization that falls apart in the Bronze Age collapse is really remarkably long range trade routes. There's all of this, especially not, huge amounts of goods often, especially for goods that are really sort of reserved for the nobility, things that are kind of specialized goods. But there's definitely a lot of going around, and that's part of, right, this idea of like the Greek age of traveling heroes is sort of written from much later, but is looking back at this period where this is kind of a necessary part of life. And then once the Iron Age happens, you don't need to trade for tin or copper anymore because iron is everywhere. Iron is super, super common as a metal in the Earth's crust. And this is sort of in the texture of like this age of Greek exploration that ends up sort of turning into the classical age that is not totally centered on mainland Greece, but has this very different character and then eventually we're getting into the later stuff of like the Persian Wars, and then eventually Alexander the Great. So there's a really interesting kind of technological necessity to this age of adventure that I think is kind of a neat
Mm,
way to look at it.
Absolutely. And that's actually paralleled also. And I think you mentioned this a little bit, but the Homeric cycle, the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, these are all actually, if you look deeper into the text, you can see that they are parallels to these transitional ages. And so I've talked a little bit about the Odyssey in the past, but I'll kind of rehash a little. But the Odyssey is a great fantasy adventure gaming read. There's a little bit of controversy on X, formerly Twitter, right now, because there were some folks who came out who'd never read the Odyssey, and those of us who grew up, prior to the millennium, were surprised because we thought that was standard. But I encourage anybody who's listening, if they haven't read it, to read it. If you haven't read it in a while, reread it because it's a great inspirational material. One for an adventure type game because you see. Uh, they've just finished the sack of Troy, and Odysseus is trying to come home to Ithaca. Interestingly, from a geographical perspective, Ithaca is believed to have been on the uh, west side of the Greek peninsula. And almost like across the strait from Italy, and Troy, or the Hattusa or city that was believed to be Troy, is right near the straits where the Aegean can connects to is it the Black Sea or is that the Caspian?
Yeah,
The
it's the
Black Sea.
Black Sea.
Black Sea.
Yep. And the
Um,
reason, yeah, the reason historical Troy was there is because it could control that strait, and you
Mm,
stayed there overnight. You paid a tax so you could take favorable weather to go through the strait. But that's not what I was talking about. His journey home should not have taken him however many years, but it did because he goes through all of these episodic type adventures. He uses his wits, he uses his martial prowess. It's all of the classical elements of a role-playing game. So you think in combats where you can't win, you think your way through it. There's the environmental travel hazards that they go past, and at the same time, to go back to what we were talking about, the this is a transition. During the heroic era, you have Achilles, you have Hercules, where your protagonist, so to speak, your classical hero isn't a hero in the sense of I am a do-gooder. They're the hero in the sense of I have the blood of the gods. I'm super strong. I'm a good warrior. I'm a king. And so you have this divine blood, you have this combat prowess, and you have this concept of honor and honor combat. The Odyssey has elements of that, but it also has elements of the Iron Age, Age of the Merchant, where your protagonist is using his wits to get through things. And I want to say Loki, but that's a totally different. That's Nordic, so that's a continent away. But the same principle applies during the later Greek period. You have a transition into the age of the merchant, and where you get more stories that talk about getting by on your wits. The importance of being a king is lessened. There's less of the focus on the divine blood and more on uh, earning, being smart about what you're doing. And the Odyssey is interesting in that regard because it's a marked point of that transition. Because you have the Iliad, which is very obvious. It's the king of uh, there's Hector of Troy, who's the son of Priam. Then you have Achilles of the what's his city? But he's the lord of a city, and so you have these heroic combat one on one. But Odysseus doesn't always do that. There are certain points like where he's engaging the suitors. He's the strongest. He's the only one who can get his bow strung. But you have other places like Polyphemus where he tricks the guy. He tricks the Cyclops because he knows he can't win that battle. And so it's this balance between classical heroic values and I guess modern's the wrong word, but we're talking 2000 years ago. But you have the difference between the heroic era, or the Bronze Greeks, and then the post-heroic era where you have the Iron.
right. Yeah. So Oh, by the way, I just should mention that there is a new movie talking or on the Odyssey, inspired by the Odyssey, called The Return, which is the kind of last bit.
Yeah.
It's got Ralph Fiennes as Odysseus and Juliette Binoche as Penelope, and I guess the other Charlie Plummer as Telemachus. So it looked pretty good. I've not seen it. It came out earlier in December. So, but that's it's pretty interesting. So that is a very interesting transition. So I guess we're jumping around. We had a outline, but we've already thrown it out. So
I'm
so just to
sorry.
ask you,
Well,
Taylor, and then we'll let Arlen talk about inspiration and games and what I guess what game would you use to run an Odyssey like tale?
I think that's a good one. Because when we're talking about the Odyssey, there's a couple things that you definitely need to have. You need to have the exploration factor because you're moving. You have some familiar places, some unfamiliar places, and some places that you will have heard about through stories, but you've never visited. And you don't necessarily, it's not like you can't, like it's not like Odysseus could have gone onto, Google Maps and found where Troy was, but he would have had to have moved along and based it on um, local guidance. And so this is something that persisted even into the Roman era. A little trivia for the Romans is they never really used representative maps. Like right now, if you go to an atlas and open it up, you can see like where like I'm in Florida, you can see the Panhandle, you see the peninsula, and you have I-95 and I whatever going across. The Romans never did that. What the Romans would do is they would almost like if you remember printing out MapQuest directions, it would be more like that. It would be like take you have 2 days march from Jacksonville over to Lake City, and then from Lake City you're going to ask somebody because you want to go north towards Macon and through Thomasville, and so you would have these points. So you'd want to have that exploration element. You'd want to have that mapping element. There's naval, the Mediterranean, the Aegean. You see a lot of movement of goods along the waterways, in particular because Greece and Anatolia both are very mountainous, and so the waterways are very important. So you want to have naval rules. Um, so my gut reaction is I would probably just run with original Dungeons and Dragons. I've got my side print out here because you've got essentially everything you need there. You have your basic adventure elements, you have your naval rules in the second booklet, and you have your mass combat eligibility. So you can graduate from just your ship of guys, the 50 or so that were rowing the boat you were in and got lost in, but you could also roll back the clock and use the mass combat elements to do those naval engagements and then lay siege to Troy.
Cool. Yeah, I like that idea of like exploration and hex crawl and this one would take some work, but I think one game that's a more modern game because I definitely think OD&D or I guess Swords and Wizardry is that close enough because of its yeah if you can't get a hold of those cool little brown books like the One Ring, you'd have to change it a lot, but the One Ring from Free League has these amazing like travel rules and that exploration and some places are more perilous than others and some places are safe havens and I think that could work into it as well. So I think that's inspired me already there, Taylor. So thank
Yeah,
you.
that would work great. Yeah.
All right, Arlen, what do you want to run? What have you run? What time period in the expansive Greek myth and literature and
Mm.
history?
Um, well, let's start with the literature and history part. I agree that something essentially at this kind of early period, long before we get into classical Greece, would be interesting. I think you could do interesting stuff in a number of later periods, including one of the things that I think would be really fascinating would be to do. Um, because Alexander the Great was such a kind of completely larger than life figure in so many ways, there are these kind of immense collections of mythological tales that have sprung up around Alexander himself or things related to Alexander, partly because he, involved himself with all of these different cultures throughout Central Asia and the Near East and all of these different places that he went. Sometimes, well, most times fought battles and sometimes made allies and enemies and all of these different groups that supposedly have um, some particular connection. And you have the kind of more historically bounded ones, but then you also have like there's a really interesting I don't remember who it is that records this myth that Alexander the Great reaches the end of the world. He reaches a gate in the Hindu Kush, and there's nothing on the other side. This mountain range is the end of the earth. And he comes up to the gate and he like listens at the keyhole and hears chaos on the other side and retreats from the ends of existence, basically. Um, which is fascinating and totally this stuff of like a classic fantasy adventure story to reach the end of what the earth is and have to turn back or something like that. And so I think it would be really interesting to do something either related kind of to that body of mythology or even to do something with the successors. I mean, Alexander the Great doesn't leave behind like a real plan for what should happen with his immense conquests, which is how we get into the Diadochi Wars, the wars of his successors. Basically, all of his generals who are still very talented leaders, although often not as talented as Alexander himself, and have immense numbers of the most veteran soldiers in the entire world at this point. And there's so much kind of interesting stuff that happens as they end up trying to figure out how they're going to divide up the empire. And at first, they don't even think that they're going to divide it. They kind of assume that, well, the next Macedonian king will be king of this continent-spanning empire that stretches from, Macedonia and even further north into modern-day Bulgaria and then down all the way through Egypt and then out all the way to like the Indus River Valley, that this huge territory is going to be ruled either by Alexander the Great's half-brother, who probably was developmentally stifled. It's unclear exactly what was going on, but that's probably why he survived, because the Argeads had a bad history of killing off all of the male members who might otherwise potentially take power. Or Alexander's bride, Roxanne, is pregnant when he dies, and she gives birth to a son. And so there's an assumption of, well, what is actually going to happen? I think you could do something really interesting with this kind of huge world-spanning empire with all of these characters who are sort of all conspiring against each other and have all of these different things that they come up with. Ptolemy himself ends up taking over Egypt and he ends up stealing Alexander's body as it is being taken back to Macedon. And this becomes a huge kind of coup for his propaganda. And he starts minting coins that have Alexander the Great's head wearing an elephant head as a headdress, like the way you might wear a lion's skin if you were Hercules. Which obviously physically doesn't work because an elephant's head is way too big, but it's such a great image that it's so fun and interesting that I think it would be really fun to do something in that kind of period of chaos where, however you put the player characters into that, there will be interesting things for them to engage with in the world because there's so much going on right then and so many decisions being made about, what the world what that part of the world ends up looking like for the next, 150, 200 years or more.
They put him in honey, didn't they?
Yeah,
To preserve
they've
them, right?
tried to figure out ways to preserve his body. He is eventually brought to the Nile, and he has a tomb in Alexandria, the city that he founded in the Nile Delta, famously visited by both Julius Caesar and Octavian Augustus many centuries later. He ends up also one of his sort of successor generals is actually the man who was basically his scribe, who was in charge of dictating, this man named Eumenes, who was a Greek, which was not common for generals because most of them were true Macedonians, not Greeks, but he was a Greek scribe who Alexander, before he died, appointed as a captain of the cavalry, and he ends up becoming really important in the kind of first era of the successors. But none of the Macedonians want to listen to him, so he comes up with this thing where they set up a throne with Alexander's armor on it, as if the spirit of Alexander is present on this throne inside the command tent, and that way the Macedonians will attend his meetings and listen to his orders when he's trying to tell them what they need to do to fight off the other successors.
Mhm.
Because the image of Alexander himself is so kind of immensely powerful for all of these men who have lived through the age of his conquests, basically.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, I think, and you could go, kind of straight historical type, maybe BR something like BRP, rune and added magic like with RuneQuest, or even like D&D, right? I mean, there's a lot
Yeah,
of
well, and
like
that's
adding fantasy, as many fantasy elements as you want to,
one
or it's
especially.
all like, sorry,
And when you're talking about like the history that is recorded about this, right? The ancient historians did not necessarily make that distinction that we would
no,
make between what is like the real history that happened and what is this kind of mythologized version, right? Herodotus famously is happy to report a number of things that are remarkably true, and it's kind of incredible that he could find that out, and a number of things that are just insane and have no basis in any reality, but he's happy to repeat it because he heard it from someone. And you could totally do an interesting a fantasy world that has so many of the things that we expect from fantasy that are just sort of a part of this world because it is so large and there's so many unexplored places
right?
in the world in the territory that our ersatz Alexander conquered, that there's plenty of room for any number of other things.
You could even have a group of skeptics that are trying to debunk all these myths or something, or make it more of a like almost a conspiracy, like a
Hmm.
like Hellenistic era conspiracy type of game, right? Where they're trying to find out the truth behind the spirit armor, or is the
Well,
end
and
of the
there's
world really there? What happened to Alexander's heir? I mean, there's so many.
Well, and there's so many kind of fascinating little sort of little bits that you could use as the basis for an adventure. For instance, one of Alexander's generals relinquishes the claim that Alexander pressed on the Indus River Valley. Basically, Alexander reached at the furthest the Indus River Valley, beats up basically a bunch of the kings around there and says, "You have to follow what I do." Of course, they don't really have a good way to press their forces out that far, so it's only kind of in the most nominal sense of control is it part of Alexander's empire. But after he dies, it's not Seleucus, it's someone else who Seleucus takes over from. But basically makes an agreement with the kings in this part of the world, and because they're being united under Chandragupta, I think. Um, and says, "Hey, we will totally relinquish any claim to all of this in exchange for elephants," and buys like 100 elephants from them because elephants are sort of the right. They're huge and incredibly powerful and really
And they get good
dangerous
hats
in
according to
battle.
coins.
Yeah, they're good. They're good for the coins too. But elephants are this kind of immense weapon of war that the Greeks have just recently found out about and are like, oh my God, these are like super cool. It turns out they're not always super cool because they sometimes run amok on your own troops, and also they have a tendency to die when you take them away from places that they like exist naturally and all sorts of others. But for, 20 or 30 years, 100 elephants is basically you've got the core of the most powerful army in all of the Near East, basically, with that. And that would be, right, that could be an interesting adventure by itself, is just the delegation that has to make it halfway across the world to buy a whole bunch of elephants for the pretender who's trying to stay in power, and negotiating that would be, I think, such a fun, right? 'Cause you have this huge travel adventure, you see all these different things, and then you get to the other side of the empire and have to kind of negotiate with all of these different elements. And, it wouldn't even have to be elephants in a fantasy world. It could
It
be
could be
dragons if you
yeah,
wanted. Yeah.
exotic. It could be like you said, dragons, or right. So be like almost uh, a Greek era Silk Road type adventure where you're traveling over in that direction with all the things that would be exotic and strange and fanciful to someone who never experienced that from sort of the Mediterranean, right? So I think that'd be pretty fascinating. Like
Yep.
for me, I think I drop back. So one of my inspirations actually is this drop back in time, maybe mythological time. So one of the inspirations for this whole topic for me and for wanting to run something Greek themed is this old adventure from Dungeon Magazine. It's Dungeon Magazine uh, number 21, and it's this adventure by Craig Barrett, and it's called Chest of the Allieds, Aloeids. I don't know how to pronounce that. Aloids, Aloids. How do you pronounce that? Aloeids.
Jean Bleu Moret. No one's going to question you. We'll just run with
Anyway, I probably thought and practiced how to pronounce it, but I didn't. But anyway, this adventure it's with D&D, and I think what's interesting is it's actually it's like the adventure is like it starts out you're just kind of riding along the road, your traditional fantasy adventure. All of a sudden, one of the Greek gods, who must be still worshipped in your fantasy world, comes down and says, "I have a task for you," and he sends you back into Greek world. So then you all your armors change to like, and I think he even has rules for changing to bronze age because it's mythical. It's supposed to be mythical, where the gods walk the earth and interact with everyone. And I think that would be well that setup, but maybe I would just you know what the gods do walk the earth. It's Bronze Age. It's a mythical period, and let's just do a campaign set on the peninsula, right? Like a traditional hex crawl, you know, D&D fantasy type set on the peninsula, and you can run into anything that exists mythologically in the Greek world, right? Theseus is real, Perseus is real, or that has happened already, right? Um, the sons of Zeus are all over the place. It could be a running joke, right? So I think that'd be a really a fun setup of a game. And you could even, and I just spontaneously thought there's even that new show with Jeff Goldblum where he's Zeus, that this sort of like what if Greek existed in the Greek gods existed in modern society, and you could just run that. They do the whole Orpheus tale, right?
Like
Through
Percy Jackson and the Olympians.
Right. Something, yeah, something like that. Yeah. So I think that would be kind of fun to just do mythological with the gods running amok. You could do it in D&D, go back to your old deities and demigods book and pick out all those Greek gods and see what happens. I think that'd be pretty fun. Or like a modern conspiracy. I mean, there's a game from like World of Darkness, like Scion. It's not World of Darkness, but from Onyx Publishing, formerly
Mhm.
White Wolf, called Scion, where you have your demigods in a modern society, and you could just run it very Greek, and there could be a war among the gods. I kind of like that. Well, gods of war, I guess. You go crazy with it. You really could. So I think that's would be fun for me. Although I've always wanted to have like a cataclysmic type of game set in during the almost hard to pin down myth because of the lack of evidence, like the Bronze Age collapse. You could have a cataclysmic, this transition period between, well, before, yeah, all the gods were real and something happened, and now history has quote unquote reasserted itself. But you can still have fantasy elements, right? It's just now the explanation would be, well, the gods no longer walk the earth. They had a war, and this is what's happened. All our societies.
Well, and that's kind of how like a number of the actual ancient authors conceptualize their own mythology is the idea of like there is this period where the gods are a part of daily life and they sire all these children and they become these heroes. And then the gods realize that that's not so good for the stability of everybody else. And that is one explanation for the war at Troy is that Zeus
The Iliad,
decides
yeah.
that this is the time to get rid of the Age of Heroes, and from now on, Odysseus as the last hero in the Age of Heroes, the oldest surviving one, and that when he dies, this will be the passing of the era of demigods, and from now on, it will be regular people, and you aren't allowed, the gods aren't allowed to have any more half human, half divine children who become a problem for all of everybody else.
Yeah.
Although people still claim divine parentage after that time, so famously Alexander himself.
Alexander, exactly. Oh yeah, so then you could really run like there is this what is this? There's a cipher system game that I think it's Godsfall or something like that, where you
Hmm.
could maybe run where they're and there's another one, I think it's by Sin Nomine also, Godbound.
Yeah.
Godbound.
Yes.
And that's a fun game where you're like, whoa, I can't believe it's fun because like you're from the get-go, you're starting like domain play, right? Because all these heroes are larger than life. They have their own domains, and you're basically gods, and you could put it in any sort of theme you wanted to, right? So I think that'd be pretty interesting too. In that that transition period, right? And maybe there still are, if Zeus has gone behind, the veil, still sending out assassins or something to destroy these people, right? That'd be very interesting. I guess maybe that's the theme of Gods of War, isn't it? Is that the premise of that? I've never played that video game, so I don't know.
I have
Uh, Kinda. Well, so God of War is weird, partly because after a certain point they decide that they want to make The Last of Us instead of God of War, and so then they make the most recent two games. Um, but the old ones are odd. The story is Kratos, who is a Spartan warrior who has done a bunch of bad stuff in the past, and somehow Ares is coming to destroy Sparta, and he has to kill Ares so that he can be the new God of War. And then he also there's more bad stuff that happens, and he ends up having to kill most of the rest of the gods too. Um,
Oh,
and
so he's a
it's
god killer. Okay.
yeah, he does a lot of he's a big fan of killing gods or mythological monsters.
Mhm.
That there's plenty of killing mythical
I
monsters
blame
too.
I blame that video game series for the I'm not going to say tastelessness, but the change in flavor, we'll say, for between the classic um, Clash of the Titans and the remake Clash of the Titans.
Yeah, that would be
Yeah.
that right there would be an awesome adventure, Clash of the Titans. And you could do total, any system you choose. I mean, I probably would
In a heartbeat.
jump jump back to D&D or D&D like, right? So,
And
um,
on the note, we started talking about systems again, and I realized after I had dropped my obligatory OD&D, um, another game that I was peripherally aware of, but I've never actually gotten a chance to play, Jackals, Bronze Age fantasy role play.
yeah.
Now, I want to say, have either of you guys had a chance to really dive into Jackals?
Yes, yes. I played like several quote unquote seasons through the seasons here, and then I have like a one shot I did on the YouTube channel. And I do enjoy Jackals a lot, and they do have like it is more sort of like a Levantine, right? It is more Near East, but they do have like a Hellenistic uh, representative, like one culture that's Hellenistic. So it is kind of like that Near East and that sort of Eastern Mediterranean. And
Mhm.
I think it works really great. I mean, you could, for a lot of these sort of things that we were talking about, these time periods, you could use Jackals because it's a very much it's a percentile dice roll under type of system.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and it does a great job of helping the characters build, and they're kind of like it would really work in almost in that Bronze Age collapse period because then you have like points of light, mercenary bands, right? That's what the Jackals are. They're kind of mercenaries, and going out, and no one trusts them because they're strangers, and everyone's very insular and more or less xenophobic because of what has happened in the world, right? Over the next horizon, the next boat could be a bunch of raiders, right, to destroy your village. So I think that'd be a really good to do like that Bronze Age collapse period. I think would be really good, or any chaotic period, even what we were talking about, what Arlen was talking about, like the post Alexander, right?
Well, and Jackals in particular, I think does a really good job with the idea of kind of, for lack of a better term, chaos is something sort of out there, basically. This idea that, your home is where like order is centered in the world, and the further you get away
Mm.
from the kind of center of civilization, the more chaos things are just out there. And so if you go too far, you'll end up in the realm of like the dog-headed people or the bird-headed people, or all of this kind of this, very kind of classically insular sense of like the nature of a hostile world that exists outside of your civilization, and the jackals are kind of at the edge of it, right? And I think that beyond any of the kind of specific mechanical things really captures the feel of a lot of the mythology, the idea, right? All of these Greek hero stories are almost, or I guess almost all of them, are on some level of a hero at kind of the frontier of civilization with the monsters on the other side and pushing that back, right? All of Hercules's 12 labors being basically mythologized versions of things that early agrarian civilization has to do, but there's monsters in the way, right? So he kills off the Nemean lion, which is a great predator, and he destroys the Hydra, but you notice he uses slash and burn techniques to kill the monster in the swamp, and he's got to get rid of the birds, and he's got to tame the horses, and he's got to build an irrigation system for the stables. All of these things that are the stuff that civilization has to reckon with in that period, but there's monsters involved. And Jackals, I think, really captures that sense of like there are monsters out there at the edge of what you know.
Hmm. Neat. Yeah. Well, we did. I did call this. This is the 300th episode. So, would you set a game in the Peloponnesian or Persian War? How would that work? What would you use for 300? I guess. Although I did have a little one anecdote before we answer that question. I was actually thinking, since there's so many, since the Marvel universe has a lot of Greek heroes incorporated into it,
Hmm.
that'd be a fun like Greek hero. You get Hercules and others, right? Because they appear, or even well, obviously DC too, right? With Ares and Wonder Woman, Themyscira type of stuff,
Hmm.
Hippolyta. So yeah, we could even do like a superhero game, Greek influence, focusing on those heroes and villains from in the DC or Marvel universe.
Or you could do like the classic, every because comic writers are all definitely not hacks who just have to come up with some insane idea that will just convince people to buy a comic based on seeing the cover, right? You could do the classic like, oh, the Justice League gets sent to ancient Greece and they've got to deal with you know, all of them have to figure out how to deal with being in a totally different world and all that sort of stuff. Or right, Iron Man ends up in the Bronze Age collapse having to fight because Doctor Doom is trying to set up like, the Latvian civilization really early on or something.
Oh yeah,
That
that'd
would
be
be
fun.
kind of a fun and interesting blend of because you could have, right, you could totally just use all of the mythological monsters or demigods or gods themselves just as, right, other superheroes stats basically.
Yeah. So Taylor, 300.
I would definitely use chainmail. It's a 20 to 1 scale. I'd only need to buy 15 miniatures.
That's true. That's great. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Run the Battle of Thermopylae, I guess there, right? So,
Yeah. One fun factoid about that particular battle, the Persians were consistently trying to expand into the Greek territory, and they kind of smashed their way through the Macedonians, and they were breaking their way down. And they there were 300 representatives of Sparta, but there were several thousand soldiers from other. So I think it ended up being about 7,000 on the Greek side who were able to block the pass. So it wasn't exactly as Frank Miller illustrated it, but I'm pretty sure it was pretty close.
yeah.
The
Arlen
Well, so okay, so system for 300 specifically.
or Peloponnesian War, Persian Wars.
Well,
I guess,
those are two different things, Carl. So
yeah,
I'm just going to
I
say
know.
300 right now, and then we'll
Okay,
say Persian War, and then we'll say Peloponnesian War.
okay.
Um, so I think that the thing about like the concept of the Battle of Thermopylae is that it's like deliberately not interesting as a battle from like a tactical standpoint, right? The specific idea is just you get your guys and they're hoplites, so they're in heavy armor and they have big heavy shields and they're in a really narrow spot so that the Persians can't outmaneuver around them, and they just stand there and stab with their spears until the Persians give up for the day, basically, right? So I think the question is, what do you do to make that game concept interesting. And there's a couple of ways that you could do it. But I think the obvious one is to do something a little like there's a novel about the Battle of Thermopylae that I reread fairly recently and read as a kid and liked it a lot then and liked a lot now. It's Gates of Fire by Stephen Pressfield. And part of what he does is basically spends the first three-quarters of the book on what life is like in Sparta and some other places in Greece up until that point. And Thermopylae is the climax, essentially. The battle itself is the big moment because the famously, there are a lot of details about the Battle of Thermopylae, but one of the most famous ones is that Leonidas and the Spartans are all chosen as men who have living sons. The idea being that they are not expected to come back and that they are picking all soldiers who the bloodline will not die out when they don't come back, and that's a very deliberate choice on the part of the Spartans, unlike all of these other contingents from the rest of the Greek world who mostly just send their regular soldiers expecting to be there for a little while, but not to die there necessarily.
Mhm.
Um, and I think the way that you make that compelling is you do all of the other campaign stuff of what life is like in the world that they are, prepared to give up when you get to the final. And especially, I mean, part of the thing about the Persian Wars and Thermopylae is that the Persians had already tried to invade Greece 10 years before at the Battle of Marathon, famously, the Spartans not involved in that battle, but everyone was aware. Even from before that point, that this is what the Persians were going to do, right? The Persian Empire far too large and bureaucratic to hide its warmongering tendencies on any level, and especially once Xerxes comes to power and starts expanding into basically the north of modern day Greece, and up into modern day Macedonia and Bulgaria and all that sort of stuff. They all know that this is coming. And so I think you could totally have this, the impending doom of the campaign is the eventual invasion. You don't know necessarily when it is going to happen, but it is kind of hanging over the entire time leading up to eventually it's like, okay, time to go. This is the battle. Um, and then the other thing is that, the Greeks die at Thermopylae, and that's not the end because the Persians continue to invade into Greece and they burn down Athens and then they lose the Battle of Salamis and a number of their soldiers go away. But it's not really until the Battle of Plataea, which is a year and a half later. So I don't remember exactly how long, but it's a fair bit of time that Greece is kind of under the specter of this immense Persian army that seems totally unstoppable even by these Spartan heroes. And I think you could do something interesting on that front with figuring out how to kind of balance the sort of big bad nature of Xerxes's invasion, essentially. That would be kind of how you tie all the elements together, right?
Yeah, like invade the invading army campaign. This is what's happened, and
Yep.
your characters are living or created in this time period, and then like what do you do? What are the
Well,
there's so
and
many various adventures. How do you survive, right?
one other small detail. So famously, there was one Spartan of the 300 Spartans who did not die at Thermopylae. He was sent away with the other troops. I don't remember what. There are probably people who've talked more in more details about it, but that he had gotten blinded somehow, temporarily because
Mhm.
he fights at the Battle of Plataea and is denied the highest Spartan military honors because the Spartan authorities all say, well, he was basically totally ready to essentially kill himself using the Persian army, because he was in such kind of an immense despondent state because he didn't die at the Battle of Thermopylae. And it's not special to be a war hero when you don't care whether or not you live. What's special is to be a war hero when you still want to live. You just would, also want to kill the bad guys. Um, which would be a really interesting, right? Wouldn't that be kind of an interesting moment for a campaign, right? If you had a party of 4 or 5 characters, you have one of them at Thermopylae and they say, okay, this is the guy who needs to get sent home to tell everybody whatever else. And then they are the kind of bridging link for the rest of the campaign that is about the invasion of Greece, where presumably everybody else is playing a new character, but you have the one veteran who kind of didn't get the chance to die with the buddies back then. And that would create, I think, really, compelling human drama as
Mhm.
part of this kind of grand adventure that is related to the invasion of Greece.
Nice. Wow.
And turning a little bit, you mentioned the Peloponnesian War. That's the conflict famously between Sparta and Athens that resulted in this long siege and the eventual burning of and sack of Athens. But one thinking about the Peloponnese, that's a diplomacy game. That's you're playing birthright. Because you think about it, it wasn't just Athens coming up and saying, "Hey, Sparta, we don't like you." No, it was they had the Athenians at that time were leading what was known as the Delian League. They had a whole bunch of other city states on both north, south, or there is no south, north, east, and west of the Aegean Sea, different colonies and different cities that had sprung up that were in league with one another to protect themselves against the Peloponnesian influence. And so and leading up to the conflict, Athens being the largest, they had a lot of silver resources, so they were paying in to the treasury a little bit more. They had a little bit more weight, and then they eventually moved the treasury from a neutral third location to Athens, and then they started treating it like an economic empire. And there was so they were there was resentment building up among the Delian League, especially in further flung places where they didn't think that the Athenians would come and mess with them. And at the same time, the uh, Spartans were likewise leading a group of city-states. You had Argos. Argos famously hated Sparta, but couldn't hold them off because the Spartan military discipline was greater, was a bigger city, and it was built on essentially slave labor. They had a subclass of people, the Helots, who lived outside of the city. They were not citizens. In times of dire strait, they could be granted, at some point, they were granted like they were told they were going to be granted citizenship. They fought. Then the citizenship was taken away at the end of the war. And so they were essentially slaves. And so during one of the things that kept the war going was that Sparta could not commit entirely. They had to come back and put down revolts. They had to get their slaves back in order before they could redeem the war effort. And they didn't actually start the war. They didn't like each other, obviously, but they were far enough apart they didn't worry. And it was I think the Corinthians were the problem because there was a city, Megara, which was a handful of leagues away from Athens that marked a choke point that could help control the passage of goods and troops across that narrow strait to get into the Peloponnese. And the Athenians wanted it, the Corinthians wanted it, and that was our to use a more modern analogy. That was our Franz Ferdinand moment, is when the one took the other, and then I think the Athenians came out on top there. They sent like a couple thousand hoplites to take that out, and then Corinth called down to Sparta for aid, and then they came up and they brought and that's how the whole culmination started. The culminating event that there was they called it the 30 years peace before that, where they were at this sort of standstill. They were living and let living. That 30 years before the war is a game in and of itself. And that's what I was thinking about when we talk about the Peloponnesian War. So you have elements of Bronze Age gaming, but at the same time, and I think I don't I this was far enough in that I believe iron was what they were using because this is outside. This is after Bronze Age collapse. This is after the Battle of the Nile, that kind of stuff. But it is still classical Greece. It does involve the same parties we're talking about, but you have these very powerful city states that interact with each other, that make these deals with each other, that have to sometimes go to war with each other in order to solidify their alliances and their to tie down their flanks. And so there's an entire game before the actual major conflict. And so you could argue that half of the intrigue is easily those kind of it's a Bronstein at that point. So you have half of the game is a Bronstein esque that you play alongside these other major powers.
Very cool. Yeah, I mean, there's so much we can do and so much that you could tell we've been inspired by. Oh, Arlen had
Well,
another
and
point.
oh, I was just going to point out with when you're talking about the Peloponnesian War, one of the other kind of as a sort of sequel to the Persian War is that so much of what comes to define that political situation is because of the first war that, right, the Delian League ends up being established to fund all Greek actions against enemies of Greece, which is Persia at the time, right?
Mm,
This is why they end up all pooling their money together is to build a navy and an army that can fight the Persians. And in particular, as you get later on into the war, the Persian Empire doesn't go away, right? And they're still by far the most powerful player in the Near East, and they end up being basically bankrolling whoever is losing the war whenever they feel like somebody in Greece is losing the war, because the Persian Empire has this, immense budget of all of these different provinces and can just fund any of these little bitty city states to like totally allow their army to stay in the field as long as they want, as long as they're going to keep warring against each other, which ends up turning into you get to eventually you get something like Xenophon's 10,000, which is another really interesting military adventure story where Xenophon wrote the book about it, but it's the Anabasis is the story of this basically Greek mercenary army in the aftermath of the Peloponnesian War. They're all the soldiers that are out of work,
mm,
who are hired by a pretender to the empire, the Persian Empire, to fight because the Greeks are the toughest soldiers that they know about. The Greeks kick ass all the way in and get basically to the gates of Susa, the capital, and the pretender that they are being paid to support ends up getting himself killed. And so then you have this army of 10,000 of basically the toughest soldiers around stranded in the middle of a hostile empire, and they have to figure out. Xenophon famously is really interested in this idea that they elect all of their leaders, and it's this kind of expression of Greek democracy in the most hostile environment imaginable. And they figure out how they're going to get back home, and they work to get back home. And then at the end, they hold a trial for all of the generals that are elected to say, like, did they do their job as they were supposed to and not like take bribes or not abuse their power or anything like that. So it's a also kind of an interesting propaganda piece about the nature of Greekness in this period. Um, but it is another like ridiculous military adventure that would work great for your going into the unknown, because there's a lot of going into the unknown that they end up doing
yeah,
and having to fight
Yeah.
people far, far from anywhere that they've ever heard of often.
Yeah, and
right.
their trip home is almost an odyssey in and of itself
Oh,
that's
nice.
backed
Yeah,
by history.
Yes.
that's great. Okay, well, again, a lot of inspiration that we've talked about. I'm sure we could talk for hours and hours. Taylor said he could have a whole series, talk all day about the Odyssey, for example, and clearly Arlen uh, could talk all night about Alexander the Great. And we've heard some great inspiration for and some great ideas, I think, in this panel. Well, I feel I'm glad that I got you guys because I'm not an expert at all. I guess I'm just a facilitator here, and I'm glad you guys talked way more than I did because that's awesome for the podcast. But I hope you listeners have been inspired, and maybe we'll run a tabletop RPG based on Greek myth, literature, history, or something crazy like some of the mashup ideas we talked about, like sending heroes, DC heroes, or Western fantasy heroes back in time, or maybe even a time travel type adventure. But I will let my guests put in a few last words. And also, for our listeners, yeah, if you guys have any ideas for games based on this theme or have been inspired to, let us know. All right, I'll let Arlen go first, and then Taylor, I'll give you the last word.
Yeah, I don't know. I had a lot of fun talking about it, clearly. I was enjoying all this stuff. I don't know if I have any. I guess I will. One, a game that I don't think has been mentioned yet. But there's a superhero game, Wild Talents, that is kind of interesting. It's sort of in an odd place. it's sort of the successor to the game Godlike, which is World
Mm.
War II, and then Wild Talents is more kind of brings the timeline forward and also updates the system in some ways. But in particular, it really emphasizes the idea of the like sort of realism of consequences of combat as a major part of the idea of like, well, if Batman had to actually wear Kevlar instead of whatever mystical material his suit is made out of, what happens when he gets shot, things like that, that you kind of take that seriously. And there's a supplement that I think is really cool. I think it's called Blood of the Gods, maybe,
Oh,
that
okay.
is Greek mythology with that same concept. And I think that's really interesting because a lot of the actual like the literary sources, right? In the Iliad, there's a real physicality to how men die in battle
Mm,
that I
right.
think can be hard to capture in games. And so I think there's something interesting about this idea of a superhero game system that is designed to capture the reality of like what violence does to people, moved on to using that as, Greek demigods or Greek gods or Greek monsters or whatever else to capture the reality of like what violence does to people in that particular setting. And I think you could do some really interesting stuff with that, and sort of allow for, the heights of sort of Homeric prowess in combat and also the reality of like Homeric heroes, despite being very, very capable in battle, are still made out of flesh and blood, and most of them end up dying because of that.
Even Achilles, who
Even
led the
Achilles,
who led the Myrmidons. I think
who
that
led the
was
Myrmidons.
there. All right.
Achilles, more like Achilles.
Yeah,
Yep.
I know.
Well,
All this build up and boop.
Patroclus kills Sarpedon. Patroclus gets killed by Hector. Achilles has to kill Hector.
Hector.
Paris kills Achilles. And then Philoctetes kills Paris. And then all of the back and forth of who kills who at the Trojan War. Down eventually to the point of Achilles' son, Neoptolemus, killing Priam. And there's a
Mm,
in one of, I think it's Euripides who wrote The Trojan Women, which is a play basically about what happens to all of the women
after.
after
Yeah.
the battle, and it's really very grim.
Yeah. All right.
Agamemnon getting killed by his wife,
Yes.
Agamemnon getting killed by his wife, and
which would
then
happen to me too
his
if I was gone for 10 years.
yeah. Well, he wasn't gone for that long, but and then his son has to kill his the son's mother, who's Agamemnon's wife, and then he gets haunted by the Furies, and he's like, "Well, I just did what was right, defending my dad." And they're like, "Well, that's not what we see it as." And that's, all the
All right.
yeah.
All right. Taylor.
Yes, sir. Well, thank you for putting up with me. If I were to pipe up, I did save a game. Let me find it. We were talking mostly about the Hellenic world.
Mm,
And so if for folks who are interested in expanding into the Levantine, I have an not an older book. This is a few years old now, called Early Empires, a Bag Universe. It's a college kid lives in I think he's out of Alexandria, the one in Virginia, not the Nile Delta. But this is a great little resource. It is based in his home system, basic and generic, I think is what it stands for. It's been a couple years, but this is a fun. What he did was he did a lot of research onto different old world sites. Like for example, you have like I'm holding a this is an audio podcast. You guys can't see this, but Arlen and Carl can. So he's got maps that he's drawn of Giza, of Hattusa. That's the capital of the Hittite Empire. And he's got a bunch of these a bunch of these places like Jericho. You could do the siege of Jericho, and he's mapped out the gates, how the shape was, and you can use this. And he has some stats and different mythos elements for Levantine and in Egyptian and Anatolian uh, mythology. And so you can use it for mass combats, you can use it for inspiration, you can use it for a bunch of yeah, I think he has a hex-based combat system where you take sections of the city. It's a neat little book. It was worth I think it's on Drive Through RPG. It was worth
mm,
I got
very
in on
cool.
Kickstarter like 10 years ago or however long this was. Um, Further, a fun little game that came and still exists, but I don't hear about it as much anymore. I think it's Blood and Bronze, I believe it's what it's called,
Mhm.
and I will verify it. I haven't gotten put too much into it. Oh, yep, that's exactly it. I just remember one of the things I remember about it again, available on Drive Through RPG. It's got an interesting degradation system where your armor can break as you move through it, and then most recently, I've got a PDF I haven't looked through yet that I need to. It's called On Wine Dark Sea, a campaign in the aftermath of Troy. That's
Okay.
based again. We've been talking a little bit how you can make a Bronstein out of the Peloponnesian, the lead up and execution of the Peloponnesian War. This is the same idea, where it's a death funnel scenario, OSR compatible, where you have and I'll pop into the tagline. Uh, Zero level player characters try to survive the clash of armies during the fall of Troy. So it's a toolbox and guide, and I will recommend it only in that I am aware of its existence, haven't had a chance to read it, but I'm excited to do so. So again, handful of games, gaming podcast. I didn't want to walk away with too much history. So
Yeah.
again, thank you for putting up with me. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, and then I guess I do get the final outro. There were a plethora, I would say, because that's more than a handful of Greek-inspired games for the latest edition of Dungeons and Dragons. Some were better than others, right? So there was Theros and Odyssey of the Dragon Lords. One I particularly liked, but I never saw further development was something called Land of Myth, and you actually got to play. It was in the background was the backdrop was the Trojan War and you were playing people from the different armies, but like little kind of like troubleshooters from the different armies that had, of course, rivalries and had to get together to do different missions during the siege. So I thought that was pretty a cool concept. But I don't know, I couldn't find any further development other than like a free RPG day offering. And I know for sure I'm gonna have to go back through this amazing podcast and take down all the show notes because I didn't during it, so I can give you guys, my listeners, all the links of all the games and maybe some of the resources that we talked about and books and literature and all that kind of stuff. Although you can always Google as you hear and listen, get your AI to help you do that. All right. Thank you so much, Taylor. Thank you so much, Arlen. It's been really fun. I'm so glad I got to 300 at a podcast. I couldn't have done it without you guys who listen to my podcast regular and you all, the listeners. Thank you so much. Good night and good rolling.